as well. So welcome to this knowledge pool training session on managing risk. This is part of our project management training. Just need to sort my notes. Apologies for that. So the housekeeping rules are the same as before. You can take a look at those via the recording on YouTube, which will be available within the next 24 hours. So my name is Tony Langdon. The purpose of this session is to understand how risk is managed in a project environment. So the process is I'll deliver this presentation. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. You are welcome to interrupt me as well as I'm delivering the presentation. Just come off mute and ask any questions you have. I'll try to answer them and then we'll pick up. And the payoff of this is going to be that you have an understanding of the roles and the tasks and the basis for risk management within a project. So why do risks need to be managed? So risks need to be managed because it gives us an opportunity to try to avoid the risk affecting the project. If a project isn't aware of the risk that it faces, it can't do anything to try to avoid it. The famous American politician Benjamin Franklin once said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It often can be the most cost-effective way of saving money is to avoid a risk. And that's what Benjamin Franklin was saying. We should try to avoid risks if we're able to. Now, if a risk does occur and starts to affect the project, we say that it's become an issue. So what we're trying to do in managing risks is to avoid the problems that are caused when risks become issues. Because the project is going to have to react to a risk that becomes an issue. And it's going to have to do so at the time that that happens. So the project is going to have to react hastily. If we haven't planned our response to the risk, we're going to have to spend time thinking about what we need to do. We're going to have to develop a plan. And we may struggle to get the things we need in order to implement a plan at short notice. So say, for example, if there's a risk that a particular project might fail because some specialist technical staff are very scarce, if we can't easily get the skills that those staff have, if we don't recognize that early on, we can miss out on the opportunity to make sure that while we have those technical skills, we train members of the project team up so that we're no longer likely to be affected by that risk. So for example, if somebody becomes ill or if somebody leaves the business, if we've recognized that we have that risk and we've done something to reduce the risk, then if that risk does become an issue for us, we're much more likely to be able to cope well with it. So if we don't recognize the risks that we face, we miss out on the opportunity to avoid the things that can be done to reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring, or to reduce the severity of the impact of the risk. So we need to identify the risks and we need to manage the risks so that we don't need a pound of cure, as Benjamin Franklin was saying. And if it turns out we do need a pound of cure, because we've planned for it, we know exactly where we can get a pound of cure from. So where do we start with risk management? Well, we've hinted at this. We start with identifying the risks. So projects can face risks from many different areas. So many, in fact, that many organizations actually have a standard list of all the potential sources of risk. And If you find yourself working in an organization that doesn't have a standard list of risks that projects may face, if you search the internet, you'll find there are lots of lists out there. So you could develop your own list as to what are the potential sources of risk that a project can face. Now, we mentioned stakeholders previously, and stakeholders can be a good source of knowledge about risks that projects face, because the stakeholders may have worked in the business for a long time. If they're employees, they may have seen lots of projects, and they can tell you the sorts of risk that your project is going to face. Now, once we've identified a risk, one of the things we've learned to do is to log the risk. We make a record of it so that we don't lose sight of it. So typically, during the initial stage of a project, we will create something called a risk log, and it's in the risk log that we make a note of all the risks that we can see might affect the project. Having identified the risks that we can foresee, we then proceed to analyze them. And what we're trying to do by analyzing them is we're trying to consider each risk in turn, and we're trying to think about how likely is it that this risk will happen. Is this something that's very likely to happen, or is it very unlikely to happen? You know, if you're going to perhaps plan an outdoor event, and that's your project, you're having a concert outdoors. If you have your concert in the summer, then the risk of rain is going to be a bit less than the risk of rain in the winter, but it's not going to be zero. So when we're analysing risks, we're trying to understand how likely the risk is to occur, but we're also trying to understand the impact or consequences if that risk becomes an issue for us. So that's the first part of our analysis, is to understand how likely the risk is and what the impact is. And that initial assessment that we perform, that's often called the inherent risk. So when we're talking about inherent risk, what we're talking about is the risk as we've analysed it, before we've done anything about it. So we haven't planned anything, we haven't changed anything, we've done nothing. All we've done is logged the risk and we've analysed it. We haven't reduced the likelihood, we haven't reduced the severity of the impact, we've just assessed it. So that inherent risk is the risk as we find it. But we need to think about how we're going to respond to the risk. What might we do to respond? And there are a number of different ways that we might respond. So we could do something that would reduce the likelihood of the risk. This is called risk reduction. You're reducing the risk likelihood. And we'll look at some examples on the next page as to what risk reduction might look like. But we might also respond by deciding that there's something we can do to reduce the severity of the impact. So if the risk is going to hurt us, can we stop that impact being as great? And that's another way in which we might reduce the risk. So we can reduce the likelihood, or we can reduce the impact. Now, we might also decide that we can change something about the project to completely avoid the risk. So if we go back to our example of an outdoor event, one way to avoid the risk might be to plan to have the event indoors. That way, there's no way that rain can affect us. Another response that we might consider is to have a contingency plan. So a contingency plan is something that we're going to do if the risk occurs, And if the impact is going to be severe, we might have a contingency plan. And we'll look at some examples of contingency plans in a moment. And we might decide that our response is going to be to try to transfer that risk to another party. In some cases, we can actually transfer the risk, and this is often done through insurance. So if we identify that there's a risk of losing money, we might transfer that risk to an insurer so that if that risk occurs, we might lose money, but we get that money refunded back to us by the insurer. So if we're going to transfer the risk somehow, this is an approach that's called risk transference. And the final thing that we might plan to do is actually to do nothing. Doing nothing is a valid strategy and a valid response to risks. If there's agreement within the organization and within the project that doing nothing is the correct response, then we say we are accepting the risk, sometimes called risk acceptance. So we've got these different terms that we use to talk about our plan as to how we're going to respond. We can use risk reduction, we can use risk avoidance, we can have a contingency plan, we can use risk transference to transfer the risk, or we can have risk acceptance where we accept the risk. We also need to think about our plan for mitigation. So when we've planned what we're going to do, we have to implement our plan. So if we're going to reduce the risk, we have to do something. If we're going to avoid the risk, we have to do something. If we're going to transfer it, we have to do something. So we have to implement our plans. And we need to monitor the risks. So we need to keep our eye on them. We need to watch them in case the likelihood of them increases or decreases, or in case the impact on the project changes. That can happen. Sometimes it happens because we didn't understand the nature of the risk as well at the outset of the project as we do later on, or it might be something externally has changed. Climate change, for example, might change the risk that a project faces over a long time. So we need to monitor the risks, and we need to then implement our plans for risks that become issues. So these are our contingency plans that we have. And the project charter, which is a document that we mentioned in a session that we did a few weeks ago on the project initiation stage, when we looked at the initiation stage in detail, we mentioned that the project charter is a document that describes the decision-making authority within the project. The project charter basically says who can decide what decisions can be made by who. And if we're deciding to accept a risk, then the project charter may well say what sorts of risks, what sorts of severities and impacts of risk can be accepted by the project manager, by the steering group, and by the sponsor. And if the project manager isn't allowed to accept a risk because the severity is too great, the project charter would say, well, you take that to the steering group. And if the steering group can't accept it, it goes to the sponsor. And maybe the sponsor can't accept it. So the project charter says where you go if the project sponsor can't accept it. So we might need to think about risk acceptance from a who can make the decision to accept a risk point of view. But these are the steps in managing risks. And to give you a bit more of an idea as to how we might respond to risk, we'll look at some examples to help you understand the different options that you would have. So we talked about avoiding the risk. So we mentioned this example of we're running an outdoor event, say a concert outdoors. The risk is that the event will be affected by rain. And the impact of this might be that the people attending the concert might ask for their money back. So we would incur costs, but we wouldn't make any money. Now we could avoid this risk by moving the event indoors. If we move the event indoors, the risk that we've identified of rain affecting the event is completely avoided. The event can't be rained off. This same risk that we have could be reduced by scheduling the event. We could reduce the risk of the event happening. We can reduce the likelihood of the event being affected by rain by planning that the event is going to take place in July rather than in December. So that's how we can reduce the likelihood. We could, though, decide to reduce the severity of the impact. So another approach we could take would be to arrange to have a large stock of cheap disposable ponchos, rain hoods, cagoule or whatever at the event, so that we can give them out to people so that the event can still take place in the rain. So what we've done there is we're trying to reduce the severity of the impact, because if we give people a raincoat that they can put on and the event can still go ahead, people have still received the entertainment that they've paid for, so they're not entitled to have their money back. So we can reduce the severity of the impact. Now, the same risk might have a contingency plan. We might say that, look, if the event is rained off, we might have a room that we can move the event into. So we might have that room set up, or we might have staff who are trained to move the equipment from outdoors to indoors. Doing that would be regarded as a contingency plan. And I'm just realizing that actually the example that I gave earlier of having the ponchos actually is more of a contingency plan as well, because we would have those ponchos and whatever there ready, but we wouldn't distribute them until the rain actually happened. So we need to think about, is there another way that we could reduce the severity of rain falling on the event? Well, perhaps there isn't with this particular example. Perhaps the only thing that's available to us are these contingency plans of either moving the event indoors or of having ponchos that we can give out to people. But I'll continue to think about that, see if we can come up with a way that we might reduce the severity of impact there. We could transfer the risk, because the risk is actually that we lose money on the event. Well, the impact is that we lose money. So we could insure against rain. We could take out an insurance policy. And if we have to give people their money back, that could be covered by the insurance policy that we take out. So we could transfer the risk of losing money to an insurance company. That would be an example of risk transference. And the final option we have is to just accept the risk. We might just let people get wet, and we might just hope that we can run the event and that people don't ask for their money back. We can sort of rely on their goodwill and just hope that we don't lose too much money. And that would be an example of accepting the risk. And an organization's willingness to take a risk is called its risk appetite. So different organizations can have different risk appetites for different sorts of risks. Some organizations you may find are very risk hungry. They want to take lots of risk. Other organizations are very, very risk averse. They don't want to take risk. Banks are very much like that. Banks are very risk averse. They don't like taking risks. They want everything to be nice and safe. But you might find that entrepreneurial companies are very keen to take risks because they see taking risks as being a way of getting ahead of the market. So a company or an organization's willingness to take a risk is called its risk appetite. And so for every risk that we identify, for every risk we log on to the risk log, we need to assess the likelihood of the risk occurring, we need to assess the impact, and we need to decide how we're going to respond, and then we need to embed our response into our project plans so that our risk responses are part of the plan that we are following in order to deliver the project. So, for example, if we need to have a contingency plan, there should be a task or a deliverable on the project plan that is that contingency plan, so that we don't forget to create it, because we're going to need that plan to be a viable plan if it rains on our concert. Okay, so that's some examples of how we can consider our response to risk. We're going to take we're going to look at another example. So the scenario here is that we're going to be running a project to install a new payment system for a UK bank. So a payment system is basically a system that allows customers to send and receive payments. It's a very fundamental service for a bank to be able to make and receive payments. So this new payment system is going to consist of new hardware and new software. And the new software is going to be customized for the bank by an external supplier. Oops. Hi, can you hear me? I think we're about to lose our session on yeah, it's not time, it's Yatundi is logged into this admin account on another device, so I think we're about to get logged out. If we are logged out, I will put a new link where you can rejoin me onto the Telegram group. So if we do get logged out, I'll put a new link up for us there. So we'll try and continue. So the software is going to be customized for the bank by an external supplier. The supplier has offices in India. Okay. And the project needs to test the software when the supplier has finished customizing it. They need to install the hardware that they're going to run the software on before that testing can begin. And the hardware is going to be supplied and installed by a hardware vendor who has an office in the UK. So all the hardware is going to come from the UK. It's going to be installed by the hardware vendor who has staff in the UK to do that. And it's going to be installed in the UK. But the software is coming from India. Okay, so early on in this particular project, we identified that we would need to think about the coronavirus pandemic, because the pandemic could have an impact on the project. Back. Can I just check? Are you still seeing the screen? with the scenario on? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you. So early in the project, it was identified that the coronavirus pandemic could represent a risk to the project. So we need to think about how we're going to respond to that risk. So we need to think about likelihood. And with hindsight, knowing how the pandemic has evolved, it's very easy to see that this risk is very likely to affect the project because we have staff working in India and we have staff working in the UK, both of whom could be affected by the coronavirus. And it's sort of ironic that just this very week, we're seeing some horrible news footage from India where India is really struggling with the extent of the coronavirus there. This slide, this presentation was actually put together in the autumn of last year when we had one lockdown in the UK. So you can see that with hindsight, it's quite easy to see that the pandemic could have a major impact on the project, but projects never operate with hindsight. When the project is starting out, we have to use our imagination to think about all the things that could go wrong and how bad it could be. So we have to try to imagine how bad could this be, because we need to try to plan for the worst case. So I would have, if I was planning this project in December 2019, when there was rumors of a pandemic in China, I would have assessed the risk as very, very low. If I had assessed this same risk in March, when the virus had arrived in the UK, I would have assessed this risk a bit higher in terms of its likelihood that it would impact us. And if I'd been assessing this risk in November of this year, I would have said the risk was greater still. So we have to estimate the likelihood. Now, we're not going to get that right because we don't have a lot of experience with these risks. We have to try. And the same with the impact. We have to try and foresee, even though we don't know a lot about the project yet, at the outset of the project, we have to try to understand the impact. Now, in this scenario, it's relatively easy to see that if the supplier has problems with staff becoming ill in India, or if the hardware supplier has problem with staff becoming ill, then we're going to either struggle to get the software or we're going to struggle to get the hardware, or possibly both. Now, there is a concept as well that I didn't mention, which I need to, which is called proximity. And proximity is the idea as to how far away the risk is in time from being able to hurt the project. So if we are at the very start of the project and we know that we're getting the hardware from the UK, software from India, but those two things aren't going to come together for many months, we say that the proximity is quite far off. Whereas if the software is due to be delivered next week, and if the hardware is due to be delivered next week, we might say the proximity is quite close, because there's only a very limited amount of time in which the risk can affect us. So we're analysing the risk for its likelihood, for its impact, and for its proximity. And then we need to think about how we should respond. So let's try to do this. Let's say that the likelihood we might say is low. If we were assessing this in December of 2019, we might have said this is low because none of us have lived through a pandemic before. So we don't know how likely it is to come to the UK or to come to India. But if it did come, we can say, well, what's the impact? The impact is going to be to incapacitate some members of staff. It might be to prevent members of staff from working in the same office. It might delay the installation of the hardware because the engineers can't travel to site due to, say, lockdown restrictions. And all of that, the impact of all of that is going to be a delay to when we can start testing. So how might we respond to this risk? Well, can we avoid the risk is the first question. Can we do something to avoid the risk? And clearly there's nothing that the project can really do to avoid the effects of a pandemic. So avoiding the risk avoidance is not really an option for us. So we need to think about whether we can reduce the risk. Can we reduce the likelihood of the impacts? And I think we can reduce the likelihood of the impacts by doing the sorts of things we were doing back in March of 2020. So we were following the public health measures, such as wearing masks and washing our hands more frequently. These are things that we could ask the software supplier in India and the hardware supplier in the UK to do, to make sure that their staff are trained on these public health measures to reduce the likelihood of the pandemic taking hold. Can we reduce the impact that we've assessed? So let's think what we can do to assess the impact. Well, one of the things we might do is we might decide to get the hardware installed earlier than normal. So we might normally get the hardware installed, say, a month before the software was due. But if we have experience of a pandemic and we know that lockdowns are a thing, we might decide actually the best thing to do is to place an order for the hardware now while we're sure that the engineers can travel to site. We'll get the hardware installed, and then there is an impact that can't happen. We can reduce the impact by getting the hardware installed early. We mentioned that one of the impacts might be that members of staff may not be able to work together in the same office. So again, one of our ways that we might reduce that impact might be to set up remote working. And we might do that as a contingency plan. So we might set it up, but not use it until we need to. We might only use the remote working when we need to, or we might actually start doing some remote working in order to reduce the likelihood of infection spreading. Because if people can work from home, they're not going to pass on the virus to other people at work. So we can use the idea of remote working as a way to reduce the impact of the pandemic, or use it as a contingency plan if the pandemic does start to affect us. Another thing we might want to do as well as a response is to make sure that we do some cross-training so that if somebody is infected by the virus, somebody else knows how to do their job. So if teams have more than one person that can do a particular job, then if one person becomes ill, the projects can still continue. So one of our responses might be, during a pandemic or before a pandemic is due to hit, to do more cross-training to make sure that if somebody does become ill, we've got more capacity to cope with that fact that they've become ill. We might think about, can we transfer the risk? Is there a way to transfer this risk somehow? Well, there doesn't seem to be a way to transfer it. to anybody. But then we might decide to accept the risk. So we might just say, if the pandemic hits, it hits, the project's delayed, or we might not. And we go back to this idea that if we are going to accept a risk, we might need to look at the project charter to see who has the right to make that decision, because it's a big issue for the project. If we can't implement this payment system in the bank because of the pandemic, it's a big issue for us. So we've seen that one event, the coronavirus pandemic, can produce multiple different impacts at different times. And this is one of the reasons why logging the risk is important, because it gives us a way of breaking the risk down. So we can have one cause, but we can have different impacts, different proximities, different responses. And we can mitigate those impacts via a range of different responses. So this is a common scenario in projects where you have one cause of a risk, one thing that can happen, like a pandemic, but there are different impacts that might occur at different times. So you might need different responses to them. Okay. So I'm just going to turn a light on here because it's getting a little dark where I am. And I'll just move on to talk about roles and responsibilities. So we've said that anyone can identify a risk to a project, and that's important that project managers make sure that everybody who is working on the project and all stakeholders know that it's perfectly possible for anybody to identify a risk. Anybody can do it. But it's the project manager that's responsible for logging and for then analysing those risks and for agreeing and planning the responses to each risk. So what we want is that somebody who identifies a risk, they need to know that if they identify a risk, they take it to the project manager. The project manager then logs it, assesses it, and agrees what we're going to do about it. Now, there's another concept here that we haven't mentioned, which is the idea of a risk owner. And this is a concept that's sometimes used in organizations, particularly where a risk is being transferred. If a risk is being transferred, we talk about it being transferred to a new owner. That risk owner is having that risk transferred to them. They're taking on that risk. But it can be the case that we might talk about a risk owner if we are talking about somebody that is going to take a particular action to reduce the risk. If we've delegated the job of implementing a contingency plan or designing a contingency plan or reducing risk some way, we might talk about the person we've delegated to as being the new risk owner. Yeah? So that risk owner is responsible for implementing the plans that reduce the likelihood or the severity of the impact or to transfer the risk. Summary, we can say that risks need to be identified and assessed early on in the project, but it's an ongoing task. Risks can come out even very late in the project, even when a project is very close to delivering, new risks can be found. The aim of risk management, though, is to try to identify and assess the risks early on while we have more time to do things about them. And everybody in the project should be encouraged to report any risks that they become aware of to the project manager, so that the project manager can log them, assess them, make sure that they're the risk owner that's going to carry out any planned mitigation or transference. Because I would say, particularly with a contingency plan, it needs to be really clear whose job it is to instigate or initiate a contingency plan if a risk becomes an issue. That needs to be a very clearly assigned responsibility for running the contingency plan, because when the risk hits the project, there can be a degree of panic. But when you have a contingency plan, it's really important that you follow your plan. And so you need to know whose job it is to run that plan, that contingency plan, who's going to make that plan happen. So it's important that we assign that responsibility and make sure everyone knows that Bert or Harry or Jemima are going to run the plan. And if we're going to accept a risk, then we can only accept that risk in line with the authority that's given to the acceptor in the project charter or some other governance mandate that might exist. So that's our session on risk management. I'd like to just open the floor up to see if there are any questions on risks or risk management in projects. So any questions?
Yeah, I'm just kind of it bit my imagination why some projects fail.
Sure.
You know, despite having risk management in place.
Yes. So that's a good question. So we mentioned when we were talking about stakeholders, one reason why projects might fail, and that is if the project and the project manager doesn't engage with the stakeholders effectively, the stakeholders can do things that cause the project to fail. And so one risk that you might log might be that you fail to engage stakeholders properly. Now, your risk response is to have a communications plan, possibly to have a communications manager, but your response is to try to manage your engagement with stakeholders properly. And that's what all projects should try and do. So your question is very valid. Why would a project fail if it's tried to manage its stakeholders properly and tried to manage it well? And I guess part of the answer is that you can try and manage things, but with the best will in the world, it's not always possible to manage every problem and manage it to extinction. You can't necessarily solve every problem. Sometimes problems are too big to be solved. And the coronavirus pandemic might be an example of that. There will be thousands of projects that were running across the UK that have been delayed by the pandemic. And there was very little that the project managers could do about that because of the scale of the pandemic. But we need to think about the other ways in which projects can fail. And I mentioned at the outset of this that there are standard lists of risks that can affect projects. One risk is technology. So when a project wants to use new technology, if that technology is untried and untested, then there's clearly a risk to the project. Now, the project can put plans in place to try and test the technology and to try and make it work, but actually the technology may just be bad. It may not be capable of solving the problem. So these are examples of how, even with the work that project managers do diligently to try to reduce the risk and minimize it, minimize the impact, avoid the risk, even in spite of all of these things that can be done, sometimes you just can't stop the risks affecting the project. Sometimes there may be something that could have been done, but it was too expensive to do it. An example might be you might try to deliver the project in two completely different ways. You might have two different suppliers working on a solution. The problem is you can't necessarily afford to pay two suppliers to develop two solutions just in case one of the solutions doesn't work. It's just too expensive. So sometimes there are responses to risks, but they are just too expensive to take. So you can't do the things that you might want to do because it's just too expensive. And in that situation, if the risk does become an issue, if the vendor you've selected, the supplier you've selected does start to have problems, the project may fail because of it, because that problem was just unavoidable. So it's a really good question as to why projects fail, given that we know techniques for risk management. But I think the answer is that you can't always avoid every problem. Sometimes problems are too big, or the cost of avoiding the problem is too great, that you just can't avoid them. And
you just have to accept the risk.
yeah, exactly. And I think, we mentioned this phrase risk appetite.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing for projects and for organizations to think about, because any business has to take some risks. You can't be in business without taking some risk. And when you take some risk, sometimes you will win, the risk won't affect you, and you will profit from the risk you've taken. And other times the risk will affect you and you will lose money from the risk you've taken. But in business, you can't, and even in life, you can't live without taking some risk. And sometimes the outcome is bad and sometimes it's good. I guess the aim of risk management is that you're deliberate about the risks you take. You take the risks knowingly, you think about them, you decide whether you can afford to avoid the risk or whether actually the cost of avoidance is too great, so you have to accept it. And then you take the risk and you move forward boldly to try to deliver the project. And if you're unlucky, the risk will hurt the project. But if you've been diligent, if you've tried to do your risk management properly, you will have much greater success than if you haven't tried to manage your risk. If you ignore the risks that can affect you, you lose all of that time to plan what you might do or to try to reduce the risk. So this is why we try and manage risk, is because it's a proven technique that tends to make projects successful, but as you've identified, it can't guarantee to make a project successful.
Right.
You would need an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of money to guarantee that a project would be successful. And you never have an infinite amount of time and money. Okay, so that was a good question. Are there any other questions on risk management? Okay. It's a really important topic for projects. And projects can be criticised. Stakeholders can criticise projects if a risk that should have been foreseen by the project manager, by the project team, comes along and hurts the project. If somebody can say, well, with hindsight, that's a really obvious risk. Why didn't the project do anything about it? In some cases, it might be that the risk is only obvious with hindsight. But in other cases, you can say, well, actually, yes, that risk should have been seen by the project manager or should have been seen by somebody in the project team who should have raised it with the project manager, because it's a fairly obvious risk that could have happened to that project. But the sources of risk are many and varied. Technology is one source of risk. People are another source of risk. The concept of people getting an illness or people leaving the organization because they're dissatisfied with it. These are examples of how people can introduce risk into projects. People's inexperience can introduce risk. If you've got an inexperienced project manager working on a project, that can be a risk in itself. One of your responses to that sort of risk might be to support the project manager with some training or with a mentor to make sure. But if you don't recognize that you've got an inexperienced project manager running the project, you lose that opportunity to do anything about it. So this is why we try to identify the risks early on in the project and try to do something, whatever we can afford to do, we try and do to reduce the risk.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. So one last chance to ask any other about risks and risk management before I end the session. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time and your questions. Great questions. It really helps to have those thought-provoking questions from you, because it helps me pass on my experience of dealing with risks on projects. Yeah. It helps make it a bit more real for you. So thank you. So I'll stop the recording there and stop sharing the